They thought she was there to pour coffee and take orders. But when armed mercenaries stormed the remote diner where diplomatic talks were happening, she did something that made hardened soldiers question everything they thought they knew about. The woman who'd been refilling their cups all morning. She turned a breakfast shift into a masterclass in lethal precision. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Desert Rose Diner squatted like a forgotten dream along Highway 47, 30 miles from anywhere that mattered and 50 miles from anywhere that cared. I'd been working there for 3 weeks, and the regulars still looked right through me like I was part of the vinyl booth seating. Just another face. Behind the coffee pot, another set of hands carrying plates of eggs over easy and hash browns that had seen better decades. The morning sun painted the cracked asphalt parking lot in shades of amber and regret, highlighting the collection of government sedans that had been arriving since dawn. Black cars with tinted windows and license plates that didn't quite look right, carrying men in expensive suits who ordered their coffee black and checked their phones more than they ate their food. I moved between the tables with the practiced invisibility that comes from years of being overlooked. Refill here, extra cream there, always keeping my eyes down and my smile appropriately subservient. The kind of smile that said I was grateful for the tips and wouldn't cause any trouble for anyone who mattered. Ambassador Chun sat in booth 7, methodically working through a stack of blueberry pancakes, while reviewing documents that he kept face down whenever I approached with the coffee pot. Across from him, Deputy Minister Volkov picked at a Denver omelet and spoke in the careful, measured tones that diplomats used when they were trying to prevent wars. The third man at the table hadn't touched his food at all. Colonel Morrison. According to the reservation book, though he carried himself with the kind of authority that suggested his actual rank was considerably higher than what appeared on paper. He'd been watching me since I'd started my shift, not with interest, but with the professional assessment of someone who cataloged potential threats out of habit. Morrison's coffee cup had been empty for 20 minutes. I approached with the pot, moving with the shuffling gait that suggested tired feet and too many double shifts. When I reached for his cup, he placed his hand over it without looking up from his conversation. "We've got confirmation that the Kozlov Group has been monitoring communications in this sector," he was saying to Chun. "Your people need to understand that this location was chosen specifically because it's isolated. No backup, no surveillance, no complications." I nodded apologetically and moved to the next table, where 2 more suits were having their own quiet conversation about shipping routes and cargo manifests that sounded less like legitimate business and more like something that would interest people with badges and arrest warrants. The kind of talk that happened in places where nobody was supposed to be listening. Through the kitchen window, I could see Miguel scraping the grill with the mechanical precision of someone who'd been making the same breakfast combinations for 15 years. He caught my eye and nodded toward the back door, probably wondering why I hadn't taken my smoke break yet. I shook my head slightly and continued my rounds. The thing about being invisible is that people say things around you that they'd never say if they remembered you were there. In the 3 weeks I'd been working the Desert Rose, I'd learned more about arms shipments, diplomatic immunity, and offshore banking than most people discovered in a lifetime. Information that certain agencies would pay considerable sums to acquire if they knew it existed. But I wasn't there for information. I was there because sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight. And sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones nobody bothers to notice. The bell above the front door chimed with the tired wheeze of a mechanism that needed replacement. 3 men walked in wearing the kind of casual clothes that cost more than most people made in a month. Desert boots that had never seen actual desert, tactical pants disguised as hiking gear, and shirts that hung just loose enough to conceal the shoulder holsters that professional eyes could spot from across the room. They took the corner booth without waiting to be seated, positioning themselves with clear sight lines to both exits and the kitchen door. The kind of positioning that came from muscle memory, carved deep by training and experience. I approached, with menus and the standard greeting that suggested. I hadn't noticed anything unusual about three heavily armed men walking into a diner where international diplomats were conducting business that didn't officially exist. "Coffee for everyone?" I asked, pulling out my order pad with hands that shook just enough to suggest nervousness without appearing suspicious. The leader, a man with pale eyes and scars on his knuckles that told stories about violence in small rooms, nodded without looking at me. "Coffee, black, and keep it coming." His accent was Eastern European, probably Russian, with the kind of careful pronunciation that came from years of practice speaking English without the inflections that might identify exactly which part of the former Soviet Union had produced him. I poured their coffee and retreated to the counter where I could observe without appearing to watch. The new arrivals weren't eating, they weren't talking. They were waiting for something, and the tension in their posture suggested that whatever they were waiting for was going to involve the kind of action that would make the morning news in cities where people cared about such things. Morrison must have felt it too. He'd stopped talking to Chun and Volkov, and his right hand had moved to rest casually on his lap in a position that would allow quick access to whatever he was carrying under his jacket. Professional paranoia meeting professional preparation. The clock above the cash register showed 9:47 a.m. outside. A dust devil spun lazily across the parking lot, picking up paper cups and cigarette butts in a dance that looked almost peaceful from inside the diner's air-conditioned sanctuary. At 9:51, the pale-eyed man checked his watch and made a subtle gesture to his companions. Chairs scraped slightly as they adjusted their positions. Coffee cups were pushed aside to clear the table. Hands moved to rest in places where weapons could be accessed quickly. At 9:53, Morrison's phone buzzed once. He glanced at it, and something changed in his expression. Not fear, exactly, but the kind of recognition that comes when you realize that careful planning has just encountered unexpected variables. At 9:55, I was refilling Ambassador Chun's water glass when I heard the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles pulling into the parking lot at speeds that suggested they weren't stopping for breakfast. Through the window, I could see black SUVs forming a perimeter around the building. Men in tactical gear were deploying from the vehicles with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of extensive training and considerable experience. The pale-eyed man smiled and pulled out a satellite phone. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd been giving orders in situations like this for a very long time. "Package is confirmed. Targets are secured. Beginning extraction in 60 seconds. That's when I realized that the morning was about to become considerably more interesting than anyone in the desert Rose Diner had planned for, and that the woman they'd been ignoring while she poured their coffee was about to remind them that assumptions could be lethal in a business where being wrong meant not going home. I set down the water pitcher and walked toward the kitchen, moving with the same tired shuffle that had made me invisible for 3 weeks. But something had changed in the way I carried myself, something that Morrison noticed because his hand was now definitely resting on his weapon. Because sometimes when people think they've cornered their prey, they discover that they've actually walked into a trap. And sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who's been serving you coffee all morning. The kitchen door swung shut behind me with the soft whisper of well-oiled hinges. Miguel looked up from the grill, spatula frozen mid-flip as he took in my expression. Whatever he saw there made him take a step back and reach for the fire extinguisher. Not because there was a fire, but because his survival instincts were telling him that something was about to go very wrong. I moved to the walk-in cooler and pulled out what looked like a container of coffee creamer. To anyone watching, it was just another part of the morning routine. But the container felt different in my hands than it should have, heavier, with contents that shifted in ways that dairy products never did. 3 weeks of careful preparation had led to this moment. 3 weeks of memorizing sightlines, cataloging exit routes, and identifying every piece of potential cover in a building that had been designed for serving food, not surviving firefights. The Desert Rose Diner was about to become something its architects had never intended. Through the serving window, I could see the pale-eyed man speaking into his satellite phone while his companions moved into flanking positions. Professional tactical deployment, the kind that suggested military training and considerable field experience. They weren't amateurs, and they weren't taking chances. Morrison had his weapon drawn now, a compact pistol that he held with the confidence of someone who'd used it before. Chun and Volkov had pressed themselves against the back of their booth, trying to become smaller targets while maintaining the dignity that diplomats were trained never to abandon, even when people were pointing guns at them. The front door chimed. Again, but this time it wasn't the tired wheeze of normal operation. This time it was the sharp crash of reinforced glass meeting tactical boots. 4 men in black tactical gear poured through the opening, moving with the fluid coordination of a unit that had practiced this exact scenario dozens of times. They spread out across the dining area with weapons raised, creating overlapping fields of fire that would make resistance seem impossible. Professional soldiers, probably former special forces, definitely experienced in operations that required speed, violence, and the kind of precision that left no witnesses to file reports. The leader of the entry team were Lieutenants Bars, that might have been real and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. When he spoke, his voice had the flat, emotionless tone of someone describing a grocery list. Hands visible, nobody moves. Nobody talks. Anyone reaches for anything gets shot. Ambassador Chen raised his hand slowly, diplomatic training taking over even in circumstances that the State Department's security briefings had probably never covered. Gentlemen, I believe there's been some misunderstanding. We're here for legitimate business discussions. The lieutenant smiled without warmth. No misunderstanding, Ambassador. You're here because we needed you here. Your business discussions were never the point. Morrison tried to shift position for a better shooting angle, but froze when 3 rifle barrels swung toward him. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in terrain that gave every advantage to the attackers. Professional assessment taking over from professional pride. You're making a mistake, Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from years of making decisions in situations where being wrong got people killed. This location is monitored. Response teams are already en route. The pale-eyed man from the corner booth laughed, a sound like gravel shifting in a cement mixer. Colonel Morrison, your faith in your security protocols is touching, but misplaced. Your response teams are currently dealing with diversionary incidents at 3 different locations. By the time they realize where the real action is happening, we'll be long gone. Through the serving window, I watched this unfold while my hands worked with automatic precision, assembling components that had been disguised as kitchen supplies for 3 weeks. A coffee grinder that contained items never intended for brewing. Seasoning containers filled with materials that would have interested people with chemistry degrees and explosives training. The tactical team had positioned themselves well, but they'd made assumptions about the threat environment that were about to prove costly. They'd planned for resistance from trained security personnel, not from someone they'd categorized as civilian staff. Someone invisible, irrelevant, beneath their notice. Miguel had retreated to the far corner of the kitchen, pressing himself against the walk-in freezer door with the wide-eyed expression of someone who'd just realized that his quiet job at a roadside diner had somehow become a starring role in someone else's war movie. I caught his eye and gestured toward the back exit, the universal signal for people who wanted to survive the next 10 minutes to find somewhere else to be. Miguel didn't need to be told twice. He slipped out the back door with the silent efficiency of someone who'd learned that asking questions was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now it was just me, 8 heavily armed professionals, and 3 diplomats who were about to discover that their morning coffee had been served by someone whose resume included skills that weren't typically found on food service applications. The lieutenant was speaking into his radio, coordinating with teams outside. Package secured. Beginning extraction protocol. Estimated departure in 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Enough time to load 3 diplomats into vehicles and disappear into the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert, where finding them would require resources and luck that their captors had calculated wouldn't be available in time to matter. The pale-eyed man stood and walked toward the diplomatic booth with the casual confidence of someone who'd executed similar operations without complications. Ambassador Chun, Deputy Minister Volkov, Colonel Morrison. You're going to come with U.S., quietly, cooperatively, and with the understanding that your continued health depends on your good behavior. Chun's diplomatic training kicked in. What are your demands? What organization do you represent? Surely we can negotiate a resolution that serves everyone's interests. Our demands were met the moment you walked into this diner, the pale-eyed man replied. As for negotiation, that's what your governments will be doing once they receive our communications. You're not participants in this discussion. You're the discussion. Morrison's hand twitched toward his weapon, but stopped when 3 laser sights painted red dots across his chest. Professional soldiers with professional equipment, probably night vision, definitely body armor, almost certainly backup plans for contingencies he hadn't even considered. That's when I pushed through the kitchen door, carrying a coffee pot in one hand and what looked like a container of sugar packets in the other, moving with the same tired shuffle that had made me invisible for 3 weeks. Approaching the tactical team with the kind of nervous deference that suggested I was too frightened to think clearly. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying just the right amount of tremor to suggest genuine fear. "I just wanted to bring fresh coffee. I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to do my job." The lieutenant glanced at me with the dismissive assessment that trained soldiers give to non-combatants in tactical situations. Threat level 0. Situational awareness minimal. Response capability non-existent. "Back in the kitchen," he ordered. "Stay there until we leave." I nodded eagerly, the picture of compliance, and took another step toward the nearest tactical team member. Close enough now to see the manufacturer's mark on his body armor. Close enough to identify the specific model of rifle he was carrying. Close enough to catalog the positioning of his equipment and the slight gap between his helmet and vest that professional soldiers learn to ignore, because acknowledging it would make their job impossible. "I'm sorry," I said, raising the coffee pot slightly. "I just thought you might want some coffee. It's really good coffee. I made it fresh." The tactical team member closest to me made the mistake of looking directly at me for the first time, probably wondering why this terrified waitress was still talking when she'd been ordered to retreat. That's when he noticed something in my eyes that didn't match the tremor in my voice. Something that suggested the woman holding the coffee pot had seen rooms full of armed men before and had walked out of those rooms when not everyone else had. "Kitchen, now," he barked, but there was uncertainty in his voice that hadn't been there before. I smiled the same apologetic smile I'd been wearing for 3 weeks, raised the coffee pot a little higher, and reminded 8 professional soldiers that the most dangerous person in any room is usually the one you never see coming. The coffee pot wasn't filled with coffee. What erupted from the seemingly innocent container was a cloud of aluminum powder and iron oxide that had been carefully measured and mixed during my supposed smoke breaks over the past 3 weeks. Thermite in its most basic form, activated by the small electrical charge I'd triggered when the tactical team member finally looked me in the eyes. The explosion wasn't large, but in the confined space of the Desert Rose Diner, it didn't need to be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The flash was brilliant enough to temporarily blind anyone looking directly at it, and the sudden pressure wave was sufficient to disorient even experienced soldiers who'd trained for unexpected complications. What they hadn't trained for was a waitress who'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of violence in places that didn't appear on any government maps. I moved the instant the flash faded, muscle memory taking over from conscious thought. The nearest tactical team member was still blinking away after images when I relieved him of his sidearm with a wrist control technique that left him wondering where his weapon had gone. The second man turned toward the commotion, just in time to meet the business end of his partner's pistol, fired by someone who'd been making precision shots since before he'd learned to tie his boots. The lieutenant was shouting orders, trying to regain control of a situation that had shifted from routine extraction to active combat in the space of 3 heartbeats. Professional training competing with professional surprise as his team tried to adjust to the reality that their primary threat wasn't the armed colonel or the diplomatic security detail, but the woman who'd been pouring their coffee. Morrison had thrown himself behind the counter the moment the thermite ignited, diplomatic protection protocols finally overriding his instinct to engage. Smart man, understanding that sometimes the best way to help was to stay out of the way and let professionals work. The pale-eyed man was reaching for his own weapon when I put 2 rounds center mass, controlled pairs delivered with the kind of accuracy that comes from years of practice on ranges where missing meant more than losing points. He dropped without a sound, his satellite phone clattering across the linoleum floor. 3 down, 5 to go, and the tactical team was finally beginning to understand that their routine kidnapping had just become a fight for survival against someone who'd been playing a very different game than they'd realized. The team member by the front door tried to establish a firing position behind an overturned table, but furniture designed for family dining didn't provide the kind of cover that stopped rifle rounds. I put him down with a shot that would have made my instructors proud, if any of them had been alive to see it. The lieutenant was professional enough to recognize when tactical superiority had shifted. He started barking orders into his radio, calling for immediate backup and evacuation support. But his backup was dealing with those diversionary incidents he'd mentioned, and evacuation support was about to become academic if he couldn't survive the next 60 seconds. I'd moved position twice during the exchange, using the diner's layout to maintain concealment while acquiring targets. The breakfast counter provided excellent cover from one direction. The kitchen door offered a rapid retreat route, and the placement of booths created natural choke points that channeled movement in predictable patterns. 15 years of fighting in places where the architecture had been designed by people who understood how buildings could be weaponized had taught me to read spaces like tactical manuals. The Desert Rose Diner was about to become a textbook example of how environmental factors could determine the outcome of close-quarters combat. The remaining tactical team members were trying to establish a defensive perimeter, but they were operating in terrain that favored mobility over static positions. I kept moving, kept shooting, kept presenting them with problems that their training had prepared them to handle only in theory. Ambassador Chen had pressed himself against the floor behind his booth, diplomatic immunity offering no protection against bullets, but basic physics still applying to the benefits of presenting a smaller target profile. Volkov was beside him, speaking rapidly into his phone in what sounded like Russian, but could have been prayers for all the difference it was going to make. The team member covering the kitchen entrance made the mistake of assuming I'd retreat to familiar territory. Instead, I flanked left through the dining area, using the breakfast counter as concealment while I closed distance. When he realized I wasn't where he'd expected me to be, his moment of confusion was long enough for me to demonstrate why close-quarters combat favors aggression over defensive positioning. 4 down. The lieutenant was the professional I'd expected him to be. Instead of panicking, he'd adapted his tactics to account for the changed threat environment. He was using his radio to coordinate with external assets, positioning his remaining team members to create overlapping fields of fire, and trying to establish control over the situation through superior numbers and equipment. What he couldn't account for was the fact that I'd been planning this engagement for 3 weeks, while he'd been planning for an entirely different scenario. Every position I'd taken had been rehearsed during my breaks. Every angle of attack had been calculated during my supposedly mindless food service routine. Every tactical decision I made had been considered and reconsidered during the hours I'd spent appearing to do nothing more dangerous than refill coffee cups. The remaining team members were good, but they were reacting to my initiative instead of executing their own plan. In close quarters combat, initiative is everything, and once you lose it, getting it back requires time and space that tactical environments rarely provide. I'd moved to a position behind the pie display case, using the commercial refrigeration unit as both cover and concealment while I assessed the remaining threats. 2 operators by the front entrance, 1 covering the kitchen door, the lieutenant coordinating from a central position that gave him command and control but limited his mobility. The kitchen door operator was the immediate threat, positioned to cut off my primary escape route while maintaining overwatch on the dining area. I dealt with him first, using a shot placement that ensured he wouldn't be rejoining the fight, while minimizing the risk of collateral damage to the diplomats, who were still somewhere behind the booth seating. 5 down, the lieutenant was starting to understand that his extraction operation had become a survival situation. He was speaking into his radio with increasing urgency, requesting immediate support and evacuation. But support takes time to arrive, and evacuation requires controlling enough territory to establish a secure landing zone. Neither of those things were going to happen while I was still operational. The 2 operators by the front entrance had excellent positioning for controlling egress, but their focus on the exit meant they'd given me interior lines of movement. I used that advantage to close distance while maintaining concealment, moving through spaces they couldn't observe while keeping them under direct observation. When I emerged from behind the counter with their lieutenant's weapon in my hands, both operators realized simultaneously that their tactical advantage had just become a tactical liability. They were positioned to prevent escape, not to defend against an attack from their own rear area. The engagement lasted another 30 seconds, but the outcome had been determined the moment they dismissed the woman with the coffee pot as irrelevant to their tactical planning. 7 down. The lieutenant was alone now, separated from his team and surrounded by evidence that his morning operation had gone catastrophically wrong. He still had his weapon, still had his radio, still had whatever backup was eventually going to respond to his increasingly desperate calls for support. What he didn't have was the tactical superiority that had made the operation seem routine 40 minutes earlier. He looked at me across the debris-scattered dining room, taking in the woman who'd just dismantled his entire team with nothing more than improvised explosives and superior positioning. When he spoke, his voice carried the recognition of someone who'd finally understood what he was dealing with. "Who are you?" I smiled the same apologetic smile I'd been wearing for 3 weeks, checked the magazine and the weapon I'd taken from his lieutenant, and prepared to show him exactly who had been serving coffee at the Desert Rose Diner. The lieutenant's question hung in the air like smoke from his team's weapons, mixing with the scent of cordite and the lingering aroma of breakfast that would never be finished. I kept the rifle trained on him while I considered how much truth a dead man needed to hear. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, 3rd Special Operations Group, retired. The words came out steady, matter-of-fact, like I was introducing myself at a church potluck instead of standing over the bodies of 7 professional killers. Though I suppose retired isn't quite accurate. Reassigned would be more precise. His eyes widened slightly as the pieces clicked into place. Special Operations Group meant black operations, the kind that happened in countries whose names never appeared in mission reports. Reassigned meant I hadn't left the life voluntarily, which usually indicated either disgrace or something so classified that official records couldn't acknowledge it existed. Your agency, he said, not really a question, was, until someone decided my methods were too direct for modern sensibilities. I moved closer, keeping the weapon ready but not aggressively positioned. Professional courtesy between professionals, even when one of them was about to die. Turns out that efficiency in eliminating threats becomes a liability when those threats have diplomatic immunity. The lieutenant nodded slowly, understanding filling his expression. He'd worked with agency contractors before, probably in places where the distinction between enemy combatants and diplomatic personnel had been academic, so they burned you. They gave me a choice: disappear quietly or face congressional hearings about enhanced interrogation techniques and unauthorized terminations. I gestured around the diner with my free hand. I chose to disappear. Elena Vasquez died in a car accident outside Tijuana. Maria Santos was born the next day with a social security number, work history, and references that would satisfy any background check short of federal investigation. Ambassador Chun had raised his head above the booth, diplomat's curiosity, overcoming survival instincts as he listened to an explanation that would never appear in any official report. Morrison was still behind the counter, but I could see him calculating angles and distances, professional assessment taking over now that the immediate threat had been neutralized. 3 weeks, the lieutenant said, his voice carrying grudging respect. You've been planning this for 3 weeks. Longer than that. The Desert Rose Diner was chosen as a meeting location because it appeared secure, isolated, with minimal civilian presence and clear sightlines for surveillance. What your intelligence didn't account for was that the agency had been using this location for similar purposes for 8 years. I smiled without warmth. I helped write the security assessment that recommended it. Volkov was speaking rapidly into his phone, probably alerting his handlers that their careful extraction operation had just become an international incident involving a burned agency operative and enough dead mercenaries to stock a small war. The kind of situation that required damage control at levels where people didn't ask questions about collateral casualties. Your backup teams, I continued, are currently responding to diversionary incidents that I reported through channels your organization has been monitoring for months. Chemical spill at the Nevada test site, suspicious package at Creech Air Force Base, potential terrorist activity at the Hoover Dam, all anonymous tips, all requiring immediate response, all carefully timed to draw assets away from this location. The lieutenant's jaw tightened as he processed the implications. His entire operation had been compromised from the beginning, not by superior firepower or better tactics, but by someone who'd been playing a different game entirely. How long have you known? About today? 6 weeks. About your organization? 3 months. About the fact that someone was going to try using diplomatic talks as cover for a kidnapping operation. I shrugged. That was inevitable once the Kozlov group started losing assets to targeted sanctions. They needed leverage, and diplomats make excellent bargaining chips. Morrison emerged from behind the counter, moving with the careful precision of someone who understood that the situation had stabilized but remained volatile. Ma'am, I need to ask what your current operational status is. Officially? I'm a waitress at a roadside diner who witnessed a terrorist attack and defended herself with improvised weapons. I kept the rifle pointed at the lieutenant while addressing Morrison. Unofficially, I'm someone who spent 15 years developing a very specific skill set that some people find useful in situations like this. And your intentions regarding our diplomatic mission? Complete it. Your talks proceed as scheduled, just with better security than you originally planned. I glanced at Chun and Volkov, who were still processing the transformation of their breakfast waitress into something considerably more dangerous. though I suspect your negotiating position just improved significantly." The lieutenant was listening to this exchange with the expression of someone who just realized that his capture had been part of someone else's operational planning. "You're going to use me for intelligence. I'm going to give you a choice." I lowered the rifle slightly, professional courtesy acknowledging professional competence. "You can cooperate with a debriefing that helps us roll up your organization's operations, or you can join your team in whatever shallow graves the Nevada desert provides for people who threaten American diplomatic personnel." Morrison stepped forward, his bearing shifting from defensive to operational as he recognized an opportunity for intelligence gathering that his superiors would find valuable. "What kind of cooperation are we discussing?" "The kind that identifies funding sources, operational planning, personnel rosters, and target lists." I looked directly at the lieutenant. "The kind that prevents future operations against American interests and saves lives on both sides of conflicts that don't need to happen." Chun stood slowly, diplomatic training reasserting itself as he processed the strategic implications. "This incident, the official record will need to reflect appropriate circumstances. The official record will show that private security contractors attempted to kidnap diplomatic personnel during legitimate negotiations, and that their operation was disrupted by alert civilian action and superior tactical response from diplomatic security elements." I smiled at Morrison. "Your after-action report can be as creative as necessary to protect operational security while ensuring appropriate recognition for successful mission completion." The lieutenant was studying my face, probably trying to reconcile the woman who'd been invisible for 3 weeks with the professional who'd just dismantled his team. "How do I know you'll honor any agreement we make?" "Because unlike the people who employed you, I understand that dead assets can't provide intelligence, and intelligence is more valuable than revenge." I gestured toward the window, where dust clouds on the horizon indicated approaching vehicles. "Your choice needs to be made quickly. My backup is arriving, and their instructions regarding non-cooperative prisoners are considerably less flexible than mine." He looked around the diner, taking in the tactical situation that had shifted irrevocably in the space of an hour. 7 of his team members were dead. His operational planning had been compromised from the beginning, and his only chance of survival depended on the goodwill of someone whose methods had been too direct for agency oversight. "What kind of deal are you offering?" "Full cooperation gets you relocation, new identity, and a generous pension from people who appreciate information about organizations that threaten American interests." I checked my watch. "Partial cooperation gets you a federal prison cell, and the knowledge that your former employers will probably arrange for your death within 6 months." The approaching vehicles were closer now, close enough to make out the distinctive profiles of armored personnel carriers and tactical response vehicles. Morrison was speaking into his radio, coordinating with response teams that would arrive to find a situation already resolved and prisoners ready for processing. The lieutenant made his decision with the pragmatism of someone who'd spent his career calculating odds and choosing survival over sentiment. "Full cooperation, I want witness. Protection, complete identity change, and relocation outside the continental United States. That can be arranged." I finally lowered the rifle completely, recognizing that the immediate threat had been neutralized and the diplomatic mission could proceed as planned. "Welcome to the rest of your life." Ambassador Chun approached cautiously, diplomat's training, struggling to process a breakfast meeting that had become a textbook example of how covert operations could intersect with legitimate diplomatic activities. "Ms. Santos, is it? I believe we owe you considerable gratitude. You don't owe me anything. This is what I do." I looked around the Desert Rose Diner, taking in the bullet holes and bloodstains that would require explanation to local authorities, though you might want to consider alternative venues for future negotiations. The tactical vehicles were pulling into the parking lot now, disgorging personnel who would spend the next several hours documenting a crime scene that officially would never exist. Evidence would be collected, statements would be taken, and reports would be filed in databases that required clearances most people couldn't imagine. Morrison was coordinating with the response team leader, ensuring that the scene would be processed according to protocols that protected diplomatic immunity, while gathering intelligence that would prove valuable in future operations. Professional soldiers handling professional situations with the competence that kept international incidents from becoming international wars. The lieutenant was sitting quietly in booth 3, hands visible, posture relaxed, accepting his new circumstances with the resignation of someone who understood that cooperation was his only viable option. Smart man, understanding that survival sometimes required abandoning previous loyalties in favor of future possibilities. As for me, I was just a waitress who'd had a very unusual morning at work. Someone who'd reminded a room full of dangerous people that assumptions could be fatal, and that the most lethal person in any situation was usually the one nobody bothered to notice. Because sometimes when people think they're hunting sheep, they discover they've wandered into a wolf's territory. And sometimes the person pouring your coffee has been waiting 3 weeks for you to make exactly the mistake you just made. The cleanup took 6 hours, but the Desert Rose Diner looked exactly the same when it was finished. Government specialists had a way of making violence disappear that would have impressed crime scene cleaners. If crime scene cleaners had access to budgets that didn't officially exist and equipment that couldn't be traced to any manufacturer. I watched from the kitchen window as they worked, marveling at the efficiency of people whose job it was to make inconvenient realities vanish. Bullet holes were filled and painted over with colors that matched the original walls perfectly. Blood stains disappeared under cleaning solutions that broke down organic compounds at the molecular level. Even the scorch marks from my improvised thermite device were buffed away until the linoleum looked like it had been installed yesterday. Miguel had returned from his extended smoke break to find his workplace transformed into something that looked like a movie set, being struck by a crew that had done this particular job too many times to be surprised by anything they encountered. He didn't ask questions, probably because the kind of people who made evidence disappear weren't the kind who appreciated curiosity from civilian witnesses. The tactical response team had processed the scene with the thoroughness of archaeologists and the discretion of funeral directors. Every shell casing was cataloged and removed. Every piece of equipment was inventoried and secured. Even the satellite phone that the pale-eyed man had dropped was wrapped in anti-static bags and loaded into containers that would deliver it to laboratories, where people with advanced degrees would extract every piece of information it contained. The lieutenant, whose name turned out to be Alexei Petrov, had been removed in restraints that looked like handcuffs, but were probably more sophisticated than anything local law enforcement had access to. He'd maintained his cooperative attitude throughout the processing, answering preliminary questions with the professionalism of someone who understood that his survival depended on the value of the information he could provide. Morrison had spent most of the afternoon coordinating with people whose names I didn't recognize, but whose authority was evident in the way conversations ended when they spoke. Damage control at levels where national security intersected with diplomatic necessity, the kind of coordination that prevented international incidents from becoming international crises. Ambassador Chun and Deputy Minister Volkov had been relocated to a secure facility where their negotiations could continue, without the distraction of wondering whether their breakfast venue might explode again. Professional diplomats adapting to circumstances that weren't covered in their training manuals, but understanding that flexibility was part of their job description. By evening, the Desert Rose Diner was ready to serve customers again, assuming any customers were willing to drive 30 miles into the Nevada desert for coffee that had achieved a reputation for being more dangerous than advertised. The government specialists had even restocked the kitchen supplies, replacing items that had been repurposed for tactical applications with identical products that served their intended culinary functions. Miguel resumed his position at the grill with the kind of determined normalcy that suggested he'd decided the best response to witnessing a covert military operation was to pretend it had never happened. Smart man, understanding that some knowledge was more burden than benefit, especially when that knowledge involved people who could make problems disappear as efficiently as they made evidence vanish. I returned to my position behind the counter, wearing the same uniform and carrying the same order pad that had disguised my actual purpose for 3 weeks. To anyone observing, I was just Maria Santos again, a tired waitress working the evening shift at a roadside diner where nothing interesting ever happened. But Morrison lingered after the cleanup crews departed, nursing a cup of coffee that had been brewed in equipment recently calibrated by people whose day jobs involved preventing international terrorism. When the last government vehicle disappeared over the horizon, he approached the counter with the careful demeanor of someone who had questions, but wasn't certain he wanted to hear the answers. "Maria Santos isn't your real name," he said, not quite making it a question. "It's the name on my social security card, my driver's license, and my tax returns," I replied, refilling his cup with the automatic precision of someone who'd been serving coffee for weeks instead of hours. Real is a relative concept in situations like this. Elena Vasquez died in a car accident 3 years ago. Elena Vasquez made choices that became incompatible with continued existence in her original circumstances. I met his gaze directly, professional courtesy acknowledging professional curiosity. Maria Santos makes different choices. Morrison studied me over the rim of his coffee cup, probably trying to reconcile the woman who'd served him breakfast with the operative who'd neutralized a tactical team using improvised weapons and superior positioning. How many people know who you really are? The people who need to know. The people who arranged for Elena's death and Maria's birth. The people who occasionally require services that Maria provides when Maria's previous experience becomes relevant to current situations. I smiled the same apologetic smile that had made me invisible for 3 weeks. "And now you." This morning wasn't coincidence. This morning was inevitable once your security assessment identified the Desert Rose Diner as an optimal location for diplomatic meetings. The same assessment that recommended this location also identified potential vulnerabilities that would require mitigation if those vulnerabilities became active threats. I gestured around the empty diner. "Consider the vulnerabilities mitigated." Morrison was quiet for several minutes, processing implications that extended beyond the morning's events to questions about oversight, authorization, and the kind of operational planning that happened in places where congressional committees couldn't subpoena witnesses or documents. "Are you going to continue working here?" Maria Santos has a job that provides income, housing, and access to information that occasionally proves valuable to people who appreciate such things. Elena Vasquez had a job that required her to travel extensively to places where American interests needed protection from people who meant them harm. I poured myself a cup of coffee, noting that it tasted exactly the same as it had before the morning's excitement. Maria's job has better hours and fewer casualties. But Elena's skills remain available when circumstances require them. I sipped the coffee, appreciating the simple pleasure of a beverage that hadn't been weaponized or used to conceal tactical equipment. The world is full of people who mistake quiet competence for weakness, professional courtesy for vulnerability, and careful preparation for luck. Morrison finished his coffee and placed several bills on the counter, payment for services that couldn't be itemized on any invoice or recorded in any ledger. "If we need to contact Maria Santos in the future, she works the day shift at the Desert Rose Diner, Highway 47, 30 miles from anywhere that matters." I collected the money and rang up the sale on a register that had been replaced by government specialists but looked identical to the original. "Coffee's always fresh," and the service is reliable." He stood and walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "For what it's worth, Elena Vasquez was right to make the choices she made. Elena Vasquez is dead," I replied. "But Maria Santos appreciates the sentiment." After Morrison left, I spent the evening shift serving coffee to truckers, travelers, and locals who had no idea that their roadside diner had hosted an international incident earlier that day. Normal people living normal lives, blissfully unaware that their safety often depended on decisions made by people whose existence they never suspected. A family from California stopped for dinner, parents and 2 children on their way to visit grandparents in Colorado. The kids ordered chocolate chip pancakes and argued about which of them would get to sit by the window. Normal family dynamics playing out in a space that 12 hours earlier had been a combat zone. An elderly couple from Nebraska shared a piece of apple pie and discussed their grandson's graduation from college. Quiet celebration of small victories, the kind of moments that gave meaning to the larger struggles that happened in shadows where most people never looked. A young soldier on leave ordered coffee and a burger, studying a road map and calculating the distance to his hometown in Texas. Professional military, bearing relaxed by civilian clothes and the prospect of seeing family. After months of deployment to places where coming home wasn't guaranteed. I served them all with the same invisible efficiency that had concealed my presence from hostile surveillance for 3 weeks. Refills delivered before cups were empty, orders taken and fulfilled without unnecessary conversation, the kind of service that made customers feel welcomed without making the server memorable. As the evening progressed, I found myself thinking about the choices that had led Elena Vasquez to become Maria Santos, and the circumstances that occasionally required Maria to remember skills that Elena had perfected in places that didn't appear on maps. The line between those identities was thinner than I'd expected when I first made the transition, but maintaining that separation was essential to survival in a world where too much truth could be as dangerous as too little. The Desert Rose Diner closed at midnight, and I spent an hour cleaning equipment and preparing for the next day's service. Normal closing procedures for a normal restaurant, performed by someone whose definition of normal had been calibrated by experiences that most people couldn't imagine. Miguel said goodnight and drove home to a family that would never know how close they'd come to losing him that morning. He'd chosen not to ask questions about the government specialists who'd spent the afternoon making his workplace look like nothing had happened, probably understanding that some knowledge was more burden than benefit. I locked the front door and walked to the small apartment behind the diner that served as Maria Santos' residence. Modest furnishings, functional kitchen, comfortable bed, and a closet that contained clothing appropriate for someone whose life revolved around food service and small-town social activities. But beneath the floorboards in the bedroom, carefully concealed and climate-controlled, was equipment that Elena Vasquez had accumulated during 15 years of operations in places where failure meant death and success meant assignments to places where the stakes were even higher. Weapons that couldn't be purchased legally, communication devices that operated on frequencies reserved for government use, and documentation that would provide new identities if Maria Santos ever became as compromised as Elena Vasquez had been. I sat on the bed and considered the day's events, analyzing tactical decisions and evaluating outcomes with the professional detachment that had kept me alive in situations where emotional responses could be fatal. The morning's operation had been successful by any reasonable metric. Threats had been neutralized, intelligence had been gathered, diplomatic objectives had been achieved, and civilian casualties had been avoided. But success in covert operations was always temporary, and the kind of enemies who employed tactical teams for diplomatic kidnappings weren't the kind who accepted defeat gracefully. The Kozlov group would adapt their methods, recruit new personnel, and attempt similar operations with improved security and better intelligence. My phone vibrated once, A text message from a number that wasn't in my contacts, but that I recognized as belonging to people who occasionally required services that Maria Santos could provide. The message was brief and appeared to be a customer service survey from a restaurant chain, but the specific wording contained instructions for a secure communication protocol that would activate tomorrow morning. Elena Vasquez was being called back to work. I deleted the message and prepared for bed, setting an alarm that would wake me in time for the morning shift at the Desert Rose Diner. Maria Santos had responsibilities to her employer and customers, who depended on reliable service and consistently good coffee. But tomorrow evening, after the diner closed and Miguel went home to his family, Elena Vasquez would retrieve equipment from beneath the floorboards and begin preparations for an assignment that would require skills that Maria Santos officially didn't possess. The cycle would continue because the world was full of people who threatened innocent lives and American interests, and because sometimes the best way to protect what mattered was to eliminate what threatened it. Professional violence applied with surgical precision by people who understood that some problems couldn't be solved through negotiation or legislation. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the young soldier who'd stopped for coffee and a burger, studying his roadmap and planning his route home. Normal American kid living a normal American life, protected by people whose existence he never suspected and whose sacrifices he would never know about. That protection was why Elena Vasquez had chosen her profession and why Maria Santos continued that work under a different name in a different context. Some responsibilities transcended individual identity, and some commitments required the kind of dedication that couldn't be explained to people who'd never faced the choice between personal safety and professional duty. The Desert Rose Diner would open tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., and Maria Santos would be there to serve coffee to whoever needed it. Truckers and travelers, families and soldiers, normal people living normal lives in a country that remained safe. Because abnormal people made abnormal sacrifices in places where normal rules didn't apply. And if circumstances required it, Elena Vasquez would remind the world's predators that some sheep had teeth, and that assuming weakness where strength existed was a mistake that could prove fatal to people who made their living exploiting the innocent. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in any room is the one pouring your coffee, and sometimes the best protection is the threat that nobody sees coming until it's too late to matter. The morning sun would rise over the Nevada desert in a few hours, painting the Desert Rose Diner in shades of amber and possibility. Another day of normal service in a normal restaurant, staffed by normal people who'd chosen to make their living feeding travelers and locals who appreciated good food and reliable service. Unless circumstances required otherwise, in which case, the world's predators would discover that some waitresses served more than coffee, and that underestimating the quiet professional behind the counter could be the last mistake they ever made. But until then, Maria Santos would maintain her cover, serve her customers, and wait for the next time that Elena Vasquez's particular skill set became necessary to protect the kind of normal life that made all the abnormal sacrifices worthwhile. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.